Before the great flood carved its scar across the earth, there walked beings that should never have existed in the realm of mortals. They were not fully human, and they were not fully divine, but something twisted and terrible in between those sacred boundaries. The ancient texts call them Nephilim, a name that still whispers through the corridors of forgotten history like a dark wind. What if the line between heaven and earth was not meant to be crossed, and someone crossed it anyway? This is not just a story of giants who shook the ground with their footsteps, but a story of rebellion that shook the very throne of God. In the days when the world was young, and humanity still remembered how to speak with wonder, the sons of God looked down from their celestial heights. They saw the daughters of men dancing in the firelight of their villages, beautiful and alive with laughter and joy. And desire, dark and consuming as a wildfire, ignited in hearts that were never meant to burn with such earthly longing and forbidden passion. The Watchers, they were called, angels assigned to guard humanity from the shadows and keep the ancient order intact and unbroken. But watching became wanting, and wanting became a choice that would curse the earth for generations yet to come and beyond. They descended like falling stars, leaving trails of light that turned to ash as they touched the corrupted ground below. These divine beings took human women as their wives, breaking the sacred boundary that separated the eternal from the temporal and fleeting. And from these unholy unions, children were born who grew to heights that made the cedars of Lebanon seem like grass beneath their feet. The Nephilim rose like mountains of flesh and fury, their shadows falling across entire cities like the wings of death itself. They were warriors without equal, their strength capable of tearing stone walls apart with their bare hands, as if they were made of paper. But strength without wisdom is a sword without a sheath, and these giants knew only hunger, violence, and the terrible thirst for more power. Have you ever felt the presence of something that shouldn't exist? Something that makes your soul recoil in instinctive fear and ancient recognition? The earth itself groaned under the weight of their footsteps, and the very stones cried out against the corruption spreading like poison through creation. Villages were crushed beneath their rage, and the screams of the innocent rose to heaven like smoke from 1,000 burning altars of despair. God looked down from his throne and saw that the wickedness of man was great, and that every intention of the human heart was only evil continually. But it was not just human wickedness that grieved his heart. It was the corruption of the divine order, the breaking of the eternal covenant. The Watchers had taught forbidden knowledge to humanity, secrets of war and seduction, of sorcery and the forging of weapons designed to kill. They revealed the mysteries of the heavens to those who were meant to walk in simple faith upon the earth, and the balance was shattered forever. And the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. It was a judgment spoken in sorrow, not in anger alone. For even God's heart can break when his children choose the path of destruction. The Nephilim grew in number and in cruelty, their appetites consuming everything in their path like a plague of locusts devouring the harvest. They devoured the produce of the land until nothing remained, and then they turned upon humanity itself, feeding on flesh, and spreading terror like darkness. Mothers hid their children in caves and whispered prayers to a God who seemed to have turned his face away from their suffering and tears. Fathers took up arms they could barely lift, knowing they would fall before these giants like wheat before the scythe of an inevitable harvest. What would you have done if you had lived in those days, when hope was a memory and tomorrow was a promise no one dared to believe? There was one man, however, whose name meant rest, and in him God found a flicker of righteousness in a world drowning in corruption and violence. Noah walked with God when everyone else was running toward destruction, his steps steady and faithful, even as the ground trembled beneath the giant's rage. God spoke to Noah in the stillness of the night, his voice like thunder wrapped in tenderness, carrying both judgment and an impossible promise of salvation. Build an ark, God commanded, a vessel of salvation in a world that had forgotten what it meant to be saved from anything at all. Noah's hands, calloused and worn, began to shape wood into something that would float when the whole world would drown in the consequences of its choices. His neighbors mocked him as he built, their laughter sharp and bitter, for rain was a concept they barely understood in their arrogance and blindness. The Nephilim watched with eyes that burned with ancient malice, sensing somehow that their days were numbered, like grains of sand in an hourglass running empty. The Watchers who had fathered these abominations were bound in chains of darkness, cast into the depths where no light reaches and no mercy dwells. God's judgment fell upon them like a hammer upon an anvil, and their cries echoed through the spiritual realms as a warning to all who would rebel. But their children, the Nephilim, still walked the earth, still spread their corruption, still crushed the innocent beneath their feet without remorse or hesitation. Not just a flood of water was coming, but a flood of divine justice that would wash the earth clean of the stain that had spread too far. The fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened, and rain fell like the tears of God upon a world he had loved. The waters rose, and the Nephilim, for all their terrible strength and towering height, could not fight the tide of judgment that swallowed everything whole. They clawed at the rising flood, their roars of rage turning to screams of terror as the very element of life became the instrument of their destruction. The earth was cleansed by water, purified by the same force that had once brought life, now bringing an end to the corruption that had poisoned creation itself. Can you imagine the silence that followed, when the waters finally stilled and only the ark remained, floating alone on an endless sea of divine reset? But the story does not end with the flood, for the corruption had planted seeds that would sprout again in the land of Canaan and beyond. When the Israelites came to claim their promised inheritance, they found giants in the land, descendants of the Nephilim who had somehow survived through bloodlines. The sons of Anak stood like towers of flesh and fury, and the spies who saw them felt like grasshoppers in their own eyes, small and insignificant. What if the greatest battles we face are not against flesh and blood alone, but against the ancient corruption that refuses to die completely? David, a shepherd boy with a heart like a lion, stood before Goliath, a giant who mocked the armies of the living God with every breath. The stone flew from David's sling with the force of faith behind it, and the giant fell like a mountain crashing down upon the earth below. It was not just a boy defeating a warrior. It was humanity, reclaiming the authority that had been stolen by the rebellion of the Watchers long ago. The Nephilim were a shadow of what should never have been, a reminder that when divine order is broken, chaos and suffering are the inevitable fruit. They were giants in stature, but they were empty in spirit, hollow monuments to pride and rebellion that could never fill the void within their souls. Every civilization that followed would tell stories of giants, of titans, of beings that once walked the earth and terrified the hearts of men and women. These were not myths spun from imagination alone, but echoes of a truth so terrible that it was buried in legend and whispered in nightmares across cultures. The Book of Enoch, though not in every canon, speaks of these watchers and their fall, preserving the memory of what happened before the floodwaters rose. It tells of angels who lusted after flesh, who taught humanity the arts of war and vanity, who corrupted the earth with their forbidden knowledge and desires. And it tells of the giants who were born from this unholy union, beings who consumed everything and gave nothing, who took life and created only death. The judgment that came was not arbitrary or cruel, but necessary, like a surgeon cutting away diseased flesh to save the body from total corruption and collapse. God's heart broke as he sent the flood, for he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but the earth had become a wound that would not heal. Have you ever had to let go of something you loved because it had become toxic, because keeping it would destroy everything else that mattered to you? The Nephilim represent the ultimate consequence of boundaries crossed, of sacred lines erased, of desire placed above divine order and wisdom and love. They were powerful, yes, but their power was a curse, not a blessing, for it was built on rebellion and sustained by violence and endless hunger. When the waters receded and Noah stepped onto dry ground, he built an altar and offered sacrifice. And God made a promise written in rainbow light. Never again would he destroy the earth with flood, for the covenant was sealed in mercy, and the rainbow became a bridge between judgment and grace eternal. But the memory of the Nephilim lingered like a scar on the collective soul of humanity, a warning written in the bones of the earth itself. They remind us that not all power is good, that strength without righteousness is tyranny, that might without mercy is merely destruction wearing a crown of pride. The giants fell, but the lesson remains. When we cross the boundaries God has set, when we take what is not meant for us, we create monsters. These monsters may not be physical giants anymore, but they walk among us still in the form of pride, greed, lust, and the hunger for power. They are the Nephilim of the soul, towering over our better nature, crushing compassion beneath their feet, devouring peace, and spreading fear like a plague. What giants are you facing today that seem too tall to conquer, too strong to defeat, too deeply rooted to ever be removed from your life? Remember David standing before Goliath. Remember that faith is the stone in the sling, and God's strength is made perfect in our weakness and surrender. The Nephilim were defeated, not by superior force, but by the refusal to bow to them, by the courage to stand when everything in you screams to run. The flood came and washed them away, but it also carried the ark to safety, proving that judgment and mercy can flow from the same source of divine love. In the end, the giants were not immortal, for nothing built on rebellion can stand forever against the patient, persistent justice of a holy God who remembers. They were tall, but they fell, and their bones became dust that the wind scattered across the earth like a lesson written in the language of mortality. The watchers who fathered them remain bound in darkness, awaiting the final judgment, when all accounts will be settled and all tears will be wiped away forever. And we, the children of Noah, the descendants of those who survived the flood, carry within us the responsibility to guard the boundaries that were restored. We are called to be watchers of a different kind, not to lust after what is forbidden, but to guard what is sacred with faithful and humble hearts. The story of the Nephilim is a story of warning, but it is also a story of hope, for even the greatest corruption could not stop God's plan. Even when giants walked the earth and darkness seemed to cover everything, there was an ark being built, a promise being kept, a future being preserved with care. The rainbow that appeared after the flood was not just a sign of God's promise, but a declaration that beauty can emerge from judgment, that hope survives. Every time you see a rainbow arching across the sky after a storm, remember that God keeps His promises, even when the world forgets to keep its own. The Nephilim are gone, swept away by the waters of divine justice, but their story remains as a testament to the consequences of rebellion and pride unchecked. They were giants who shook the earth, but they could not shake the throne of God, for no created being, no matter how tall, can stand against the Creator. In our own lives, we face giants of fear, of doubt, of sin, of circumstances that seem impossible to overcome or escape from completely and finally. But we have been given something the Nephilim never had: the promise of redemption, the hope of grace, the power of a God who fights for His children. When you feel small in the face of overwhelming odds, remember that God specializes in using the small to defeat the great, the weak to shame the strong. He used a flood to cleanse the earth, a shepherd boy to fell a giant, a cross to conquer death itself and open the gates of heaven wide. The Nephilim walked the earth as monuments to rebellion, but we are called to walk as living testimonies to redemption, grace, and the power of faithful obedience. Their story ended in judgment, but ours can end in glory, for we serve a God who makes all things new, who redeems what was lost. So let the memory of the giants remind you not to fear the size of your obstacles, but to remember the size of your God who never fails. Let their fall teach you that no power built on pride can stand forever, and that humility is the foundation of true and lasting strength in this life. And let the rainbow that followed the flood be your constant reminder that after every storm, after every judgment, after every dark night, God's mercy endures forever. The Nephilim are gone, but God remains, faithful and true, keeping watch over His children with eyes that never close, and love that never ends or fades. They were giants who fell, but you are a child of God who can rise, no matter how many times you stumble in the darkness and dust. Walk in the light of His promises. Stand firm on the foundation of His word, and remember that no giant is too tall for God to bring down. And when the storms of life threaten to overwhelm you, look up and see the rainbow, the eternal sign that you are held by hands that once calmed the flood.